And with that, I'll turn it over to Cantor Kleinman, who's going to lead us for our first hour of study.
All right. Hello, everyone. I know that this isn't our preferred format to be talking virtually like this, but I have to say for me, it's a special pleasure to get to work not only with the class I usually have the opportunity to learn with, but to learn with an additional group of you as well. So thank you for joining us. I will take a second to welcome you to my home and welcome myself into all of your homes. And I just want to echo Rabbi Reiser's hopes and wishes that you are finding yourselves in good health during this time, and to echo his sentiment that we're all here if there's any way that we can help be supportive at all during this time. So as you may know, our clergy team is made up of several technology mavens, and I do not happen to be one of those technology mavens. I can maybe call myself a maven in training or something, but I will ask for your patience as I am continuing to learn this format as well. Rabbi Reiser gave me a great tutorial before we started, but some parts of this format are a little bit new to me as well. So I really appreciate your patience, and I know that we'll all have patience with each other as we continue to experiment with this format as well. So we will, for our first hour today, be having a conversation about the upcoming holiday of Passover. This lesson is actually sort of split into two parts. This week, we're going to be talking about some of the biblical roots and important symbols of this holiday. And then next week, you'll be focusing specifically on the Passover Seder. So we're going to be looking in our books today at the lesson that's called Pesach, or Passover. It's on page 265 in your Rhythms book. So if you'd like to take that out, if you don't have it with you, we will read the texts out loud as well so that you can continue to participate. I know, and we'll talk about that, our Passover observances are going to look a little bit different this year. So a little bit later on, we will get into that as well. So a large part of the focus of this Passover lesson is on the biblical roots of the holiday of Passover. So for those of you who are in my section of the Melton class, you know that one of the things that I really like to do when we're learning about a holiday in the Rhythms section of the Melton class is to go through our biblical texts and to sort of note what we do and what we don't learn about each of these holidays from these texts. And that's because really very rarely do we see a holiday that's described in the Torah or somewhere in the Tanakh that really, really closely resembles the way we actually observe that holiday today. And so what going through our biblical texts and what noting what we do and don't learn about the holiday shows us is it helps to show us how the holiday has evolved from biblical times until now, because the observance of all of our holidays is really a process of evolution from the time that we first see it mentioned in our biblical text all the way through the rabbinic period, et cetera, until we get to the present. So we're going to start by looking at three biblical texts that help us understand a little bit of the roots of Passover. So usually when we are studying from the Tanakh, we at WRT have copies of the Tanakh. And obviously, since we're not at WRT today, we don't expect that everybody has a copy of the Tanakh at home. So if you are able to take a look at the roadmap that Rabbi Reiser sent out earlier, I actually put the full text of our biblical texts there. So that's one option. Another option is that in just a second, I'm going to share my screen, which means I'm going to show you the biblical texts actually up on your screen. So you'll actually see it on the screen as well. So you can feel free to either look at your roadmap or to look up on the screen. And I'm going to do my best as we go. I'll ask some questions for discussion as we go, but I'm going to do my best to sort of scroll down through the participants list as we go to see if I can catch people who are raising their hands to contribute to the conversation. So the first thing that we'll do before we get started even with our first biblical text is we'll start, as we always do, with our blessing over the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, eternal, our God, ruler of the universe, who has commanded us to engage in words of Torah. And so you can all say amen from your living rooms. And now we'll get started by taking a look at our first biblical text that gives us a sense of the roots and the themes of the holiday of Passover. So this first text is going to come to us from the book of Shemot, the second of the 5 books of the Torah. Shemot means Exodus, obviously, named after the biblical Exodus story. And so I'm about to share this screen with you. So you should all now see on the screen the biblical texts that we're going to be looking at today. I'm going to actually enlarge the first one, and just, I think, to get started for ease of conversation, I'll start reading the text, and maybe, as we go, we'll find a way to raise hands so that others can volunteer to read text as well. So we're going to start with this text from the book of Exodus, and this is sort of just before the Israelites leave Egypt, just after God decrees the final of the 10 plagues, which is the death of the firstborn. So the text reads, "This month shall mark for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first of the months of the year for you. Speak to the whole community of Israel and say that on the 10th of this month, each of them shall take a lamb to a family, a lamb to a household. But if the household is too small for a lamb, let him share one with a neighbor who dwells nearby in proportion to the number of persons. You shall contribute for the lamb according to what each household will eat. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a yearling male. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep watch over it until the 14th day of this month, and all the assembled congregation of the Israelites shall slaughter it at twilight. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they are to eat it. They shall eat the flesh that same night. They shall eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs." And I'm going to point out, by the way, when you talk about at your Passover Seder, the 3 symbols of the Passover Seder, those are Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. That comes from this verse of the Torah. So Pesach is the Passover offering. Matzah is the unleavened bread, and maror are the bitter herbs. So the roots of those 3 symbols at the Passover Seder come from this verse of the Torah. So continuing with verse 9, "Do not eat any of it raw or cooked in any way with water, but roasted, head, legs, and entrails over the fire. You shall not leave any of it over until morning. If any of it is left until morning, you shall burn it. This is how you shall eat it: your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it hurriedly. It is a Passover offering to the Eternal. For that night I will go through the land of Egypt and strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and I will mete out punishments to all the gods of Egypt, I the Eternal. And the blood on the houses where you are staying shall be a sign for you. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, so that no plague will destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be to you one of remembrance. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Eternal throughout the ages. You shall celebrate it as an institution for all time." So I'm going to now take that text off of the screen so that you can see me again and so that I can call on some of you. So the first thing I'm going to ask, like I said, I like to go through our biblical text to see what does it teach us about the holiday? What does it not teach us about the holiday? What are we sort of still missing, from this biblical text that we read? So I'll start by asking anyone who would like to share to raise hands. And then what I'll do is I will either unmute you or I'll ask you to unmute yourselves, and you'll have to forgive me because some of you are listed as participants by your names, and some of you are listed by like iPad numbers or just says iPhone. So I don't always know exactly who it is who's raising their hand. So it's not that we don't love you. So I want to ask again. So what does this text teach us about an important theme or observance about Passover? And what do you sense is still missing? So I'm going to call on you, Vicki. All right, Vicki, you should be unmuted at this point.
I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, okay, good. So one of the things that I noticed is it said you should eat hurriedly. And at Passover, it takes a long time. So this is something different that, well, it hasn't come up yet.
Yes, I think so. You're bringing up a really important point, and this is something that's going to be a theme throughout what we're reading from our biblical text about Passover, is that the theme of being in a hurry is something that is a very important theme about Passover, right? It's one of the reasons that we're going to be given that we eat matzah, for instance, on the holiday of Passover. So there is certainly a really interesting disconnect between the fact that we're going to read over and over and over again that you left Egypt in haste, yet on the other hand, we celebrate our freedom on this holiday by taking our time. And I think part of that has to do with there are really in a lot of ways two different symbols that we're trying to capture here. One is the slave the mentality of what it means to be a slave in the land of Egypt, and then on the other hand, the mentality of we're trying to almost treat ourselves like royalty. It's why we drink our 4 glasses of wine and why we recline at the Passover Seder, right? And so we're on the one hand, we're eating matzah, we're remembering the experience of being slaves in Egypt. And on the other hand, we're celebrating being free people. And so in that, you do see a little bit of a tension or a little bit of a conflict between the themes and the practices there. I think that's great. Thank you. And so Vicki, I'll ask you, I'll remute you, but I'll ask everyone after you speak, if you can mute yourself too, that would be great. And then Mara, I think you are already unmuted.
Oh yeah. So where did the lamb get lost somewhere along the way?
So that's a great question. And that's actually a question that I was going to bring up for the group as well. So we know where the lamb got lost along the way. And the reason that the lamb got lost is because with the destruction of the temples in Jerusalem, we stopped the practice of sacrifice. Some of our scholars say that prayer is actually what replaced sacrifice. And so for us, in a lot of ways, the practice of the Passover Seder becomes our observance of Passover in place of the sacrifice of the lamb, which, as we see in this biblical text, is really like the key observance that's mentioned in the celebration in the observance of the holiday of Passover. And so, that was actually going to be a question that I was going to ask all of you, which is, what is it that helps us commemorate these experiences in Egypt now that we no longer practice sacrifice? So that's a great question.
But I guess maybe more practical thing is, why don't we eat lamb on Passover?
Oh, just like specifically why we don't eat lamb?
Right.
Well, so we don't replicate the experience of sacrifice exactly because it's a practice that we don't engage in anymore. Although we do obviously symbolize the Passover sacrifice on our Seder plate, right? So we do have that as a symbol on our Seder plate. And so that's really what we do to commemorate the Passover sacrifice. And that's what's evolved over time to be our commemoration of the Passover sacrifice, rather than specifically the eating of lamb. So we do still commemorate it, but just not specifically through eating lamb.
Gotcha. Okay.
So Mark, I'm going to unmute you here. And you should be and so Mark should be unmuted at this point, but maybe not. Yes, you should be. All right, maybe we'll try to come back to you in a second, but Nancy, I'm gonna unmute you as well. Okay, you are unmuted.
Right. So I have two things. One is, it's minor, but it's okay to eat lamb. There's nothing wrong with serving lamb at Passover, right?
Yeah, there's no prohibition against it. It just hasn't, it's not something everybody does, or
Yeah, we do it and we like to do it.
Right.
This, back to the text talks about just one day, right?
Yes, and that is a really important point that you're bringing up, because the next biblical text that we're going to look at talks about more than one day in a way that might be a little bit confusing for us. So what you see from here is that our very first biblical text that we're looking at is specifically focusing on the Passover sacrifice and on the day in which it happens. And that's the day that the Israelites are, that God is inflicting the plague of the death of the firstborn. The Israelites are preparing then to leave the land of Egypt. And that's the specific night that we are commemorating through this observance. And there's nothing else to it yet. So we're going to see how that continues to evolve. Next, we'll look in a second at in the book of Leviticus. All right, so I see Russell as well, and Russell, you're unmuted.
Okay, hello.
Hello.
I am interested in the phrase that says you should gird your loins and put sandals on your feet. And I don't know exactly what it means to gird your loins. I don't gird my loins on a daily basis, but I've looked it up through the good offices of the internet. And in a website called The Art of Manliness, there is an illustration of how you girded your loins in those days. And you may make your own aesthetic or erotic judgments on this as you may, but it sounds as if, according to these various internet sources, this was preparation for battle. Now, put your sandals on and prepare for battle. I guess because the Israelites had to flee in that book of Exodus, so get ready for a struggle. But I seem to recall that when this story begins, Moses sees God and the burning bush, and the first thing he says to him is, "Take off your sandals." And so I'm wondering what the group's view is on what this means what does the Pesach mean to us if we're essentially reminded that we are battling, that we are travelers. You keep your shoes on, not off, because this doesn't have to do necessarily with sanctity alone, but with beating out of there.
Well, I think the first thing I'm going to say is, you see, there is a good thing about being virtual for our classes, because now you're able to teach us something through the wonders of the internet that we probably didn't know before.
Well, I should warn everybody, if you Google this, it will instantly connect you to certain websites you may not have wanted to go to.
Well, and so thank you very much for that insight, and I will be very interested to hear what people think is the symbolism and also the meaning of what you said, wearing your sandals and girding your loins for our observance of Passover. So thank you. And so now let's try again, Mark, and see if we can get your voice on here. It looks like you are unmuted, so I'm not sure what the issue is. So I'm sorry if it's an issue with us, but we'll continue to try. So Fran, I'm gonna unmute you as well.
So I have a couple of comments related to lamb. One is, since I've been studying Torah and Leviticus in particular, I became very mindful of how much meat we eat in our family. And it seemed to me that in Torah time, people didn't really eat meat as often as Americans do. And so I cut back on the meat eating in my house tremendously. So we eat much less meat than we did previously. And I also felt that what I've learned through Torah is that when we take the life of an animal, we respect it by making sure we kill it in a certain way, that we eat it in a certain way, that we roast it in a certain way, and that we burn the rest of it, which is almost a respectful appreciation of the life and death of this animal to sustain our lives. So with that in mind, I have a lamb shank that is probably 30 years old in my freezer, which I take out every year and put it on the Seder plate, and my kids all make fun of me. But over the years, as they've gotten older, they've, I think, appreciated the sentiment in it more and more. And I think that what Torah teaches us, not just this section in particular, but in general, is to be mindful of the life you take in order to sustain your life. And that's my way of doing it. I never really noticed before that we weren't supposed to, that beef was not mentioned, since everybody in my family tends to eat brisket and not lamb, and I don't think I've ever eaten sheep in my life, really. I like goat cheese, but that's about it. But, so anyway, that's my comment for now.
Well, and it's really interesting that you bring that up, because in the context, and I'm sorry, I'm just gonna bring my picture back here. So it's interesting.
Around, you're in my background.
Sorry. And I'm gonna
while I yell at him.
We're very happy to see Steve if he'd like to stay with us. So, what I'll say as well is that I think you're absolutely right that we are showing a level of respect around the way that if we're going to eat an animal, we're going to try to not put anything to waste here. And the other really interesting piece of this to acknowledge is that that the lamb was worshipped in ancient Egypt. So there is that element of it as well, right? That the Israelites are sacrificing a deified figure in ancient Egypt as well. So I think that that's another sort of important piece to think about here. So we'll take one more comment on this, and then I'd love for us to continue with our next biblical text. So Sarah, I'm gonna unmute you here, and we will take a look at your picture. Okay.
Hey there, it's actually Sarah and Mark. We figured out another way to get through. Two things. On the lamb, we eat lamb. It's apparently a Sephardic tradition, and the Sephardim eat them. I'm not of Sephardic descent, and have for 5 or 6 generations, everybody's eaten lamb. So I don't know what that's about. And to answer Russell, I think if we think we're going to put on our sandals and guard our loins for battle, how much more miraculous that God takes us out without any battle. I think it makes us think he is something special.
And if you look at to add to that, if you look at the words of the Song of the Sea, God is very much described as warrior in the song of praise that the Israelites sing as they cross the Red Sea. So just another sort of battle imagery, warrior imagery there, specifically as applies to God. So thank you, Sarah.
For a second, it's Mark.
Oh, sorry.
So on the subject of putting the lintel, the blood on the lintel, it brought up at least 3 or 4 points. One would be, did God not know who was Jewish? Did he need to be told? Or could anyone at that point who wanted to be Jewish become Jewish by putting lintel or putting the blood up? Or was this the first thing that God was actually asking of the Jews to get that obedience, ask obedience thing that goes on through the rest of the Bible, where oftentimes the Jews don't respond properly, but in this case, the ones who became Jewish did, or else they'd be dead. Or was God just killing two birds with one stone by getting this first ask and killing the firstborn Egyptians?
So I think you're asking, I think you're asking a very important question. And one of the reasons that I will say that you're asking a very important question, sorry, as I bring my picture back up, is because in the Melton teacher materials, this is actually a subject of debate from the creators of the Melton curriculum. They actually ask that exact same question, right? Does God actually not know who's an Israelite and who's not? And the answer that they come to is one of the suggestions that Mark made, which is that it's not really as much about God needing to identify or not identify who is or isn't an Israelite, but more so the first request of God, of the Israelites, to be showing some sort of a faith in God. So, what it actually reminds me of a little bit is in the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, when God says to Adam and Eve, God says, "Where are you?" And our sages ask the question, does God really not know where they are? And obviously God does know, but that it's a test for the people with whom God is communicating in some way. But I think it's a great question, and the creators of the Melton curriculum ask the exact same one. So I'd love now to continue with our next biblical text. We're gonna look, I think, for now, just at two biblical texts that give us sort of two different ideas of what the holiday of Passover is actually about and when it should be observed. So I'm going to share again my screen with you with our biblical text in it. So we're going to look now at text 2. This is a text from the book of Leviticus. So it's the book of the Torah that comes immediately following the book of Exodus. This is towards the end of the book of Leviticus. And it says, "These are the set times of the eternal, the sacred occasions which you shall celebrate at its appointed time." So this is coming in the context of a parsha, of a Torah portion that talks about most of the festival holidays. "In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at twilight, there shall be a Passover offering to the eternal." So this is what we already read about in chapter 12 of the book of Exodus. "And on the 15th day of that month, the eternal's feast of unleavened bread. You shall eat unleavened bread for 7 days." Okay, so this is something totally different. We didn't read anything about this in the book of Exodus. It's happening on a different day. And then it seems to extend over a longer period of time that we hadn't read about before. "On the first day, you shall celebrate a sacred occasion. You shall not work at your occupations. 7 days you shall make offerings by fire to the eternal. The 7th day shall be a sacred occasion. You shall not work at your occupations." So just close this text. So this text is, it's really interesting, and it's a little bit confusing because this is giving us totally different information from our first text. This is saying almost as though there are two different holidays that we're celebrating, right? There's one on the 14th of Nisan, and that's the holiday of Pesach, which is the one that is centered around the sacrificial offering of the lamb. And then there's a holiday that in Hebrew, I'm sorry, I wasn't able to give you the Hebrew text along with the English texts that I pasted on my screen. But the second holiday is called Chag HaMatzot. So the festival of unleavened bread. So we're seeing a commandment to observe something a little different at this point. So this starts to give us, a few more pieces of the holiday that we all know and love, and brings in the idea and the symbolism of the matzah. And so what I'll ask, as a question for discussion is, which of these two holidays between the festival of Passover and Chag HaMatzot, the festival of unleavened bread, what do you think has become sort of the focus in our own observance of Passover, and what does it mean to be focusing on one over the other? Does that mean that there are particular themes that we emphasize or that we don't emphasize in our own observance of Passover? I'll open it up also to any questions about this text as well. I'll give people just a minute to raise hands, and if nobody, I see Fran. Okay. All right, Fran, you're unmuted.
So I have a question.
Sure.
In the first text we read, it said in line 3, speak to the whole community of Israel and say that on the 10th day of the month, the business of the lamb. And then in the second text, number 5, it says the 14th day of the month. So is it the same month? I'm not good at reading this.
Yeah. So it's the same month. I'm pulling the text back up again so that we can look at them together. So it's actually if you look at the first text, it's on the 10th day of the month that you're supposed to acquire the lamb, but then it's on the 4th. And if you look at verse 6, it's on the 14th day of the month that you're supposed to slaughter the lamb. So those are the 2 days listed there. And then the second text, the text from Leviticus, is consistent with the fact that the lamb is slaughtered on the 14th day. Although, as we see, there's a different holiday that's coming up that we begin to celebrate on the 15th day. Does that make sense? Yeah. I know I have the same question with but it's confusing. Yeah.
So the other question is, when these texts were written, were they already doing this? And this was to make sure that the communities were doing it at the same time? Had they already been doing this for some period of time before?
So our tradition teaches us that that the Israelites observed I'm not going to say observed the holiday of Passover, but commemorated the sacrifice of or commemorated the Exodus from Egypt through the sacrifice of the lamb this year, and then the year immediately following, and then sort of like took hiatus from it over the course of the time in the desert. So the book of Leviticus, is technically written during the period of time during which the Israelites are wandering in the desert. So, according to tradition, no, they weren't observing the holiday of Passover at that time. But as we know, the Torah is giving us a lot of commandments around what the Israelites are supposed to do once they enter into the land of Israel. So it's sort of I think a future looking kind of commandment.
So they're kind of familiar with it from the past, but they've forgotten it more?
Or they're familiar with it from the past, but like they're not doing it right now.
They don't take it seriously anymore.
I don't know if it's that, I don't know if it's that they just don't take it seriously, or that, just during the period of the time of wandering in the desert, it just wasn't practical to be doing it. But our tradition kind of suggests that they took a break from it while they were wandering in the desert. All right, so Ira, I'm unmuting you. All right.
So hi. So it seems like you like that? That's it seemed appropriate.
Yes.
So the first the Exodus is a 1 day sacrifice holiday, I guess, if you call it that. But this is more like a festival, that goes on, and it's only on the first and the last days that you don't work in your occupation. So it just feels like you're celebrating sort of maybe different or it's different types of concepts of observance. You know, the first is very somber, right, and militaristic, as we were talking before. You're saving people from dying, and other people are dying. Whereas, you know, these 7 days, whatever, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, is more about God sort of protecting the Hebrews as they wandered, you know, to find their way through. And yeah, it just has it is just to me a totally different feel to it. And I guess we eventually mashed everything together to celebrate the way we do in more modern times.
Yeah, right. Yes, absolutely. I think, you know, so it's a really good point that you're bringing up, which is that I think that the first biblical text is really a direct commemoration of a thing that happened on a particular day that we reenact by, you know, doing the same thing on the same day in future years. Whereas the second is really a broader festival that evolved from that. Thank you. All right, last one on this one. I see, hold on. Says Andy, I think it's Joni, right? Oh, no, it's Andy. Okay, great.
Hi.
Hello.
I got to figure out how to get those camels back there. I'm going to have that by the end of this
Yeah,
conversation.
okay.
Hello.
Hi.
Question regarding the Haggadah, right?
Yeah.
That's become our instruction manual, at
Yeah.
least for how to celebrate the holiday through the Seder. When did that come into play?
So the Passover Haggadah and the Passover Seder, we see starting to evolve more so in the rabbinic period. We don't have, you know, really like records of it so much before then. And so that's when we see the observance and all the different parts of the story start to evolve. But the Passover Haggadah also contains Talmudic references as well. So we know that it continued to evolve into the Talmudic era, and you know, possibly a little bit after that as well. So, and that's actually something that you're going to be focusing on next week too. So, all right. So I'm going to clear the raised hands. I'm going to bring my video back here. Great. Okay. So the last thing I'd like to do in the remaining 15 minutes or so that we have together is we read about the Passover sacrifice being a central focus of the holiday of Passover. And then we just read about this festival of unleavened bread, Chag HaMatzot it's called. And so what we learned from that is that matzah, as we know, the unleavened bread that we all love to eat over the course of the Passover holiday, is a central symbol of Passover. And so as a central symbol of Passover, it's part of this lesson that helps us to learn a little bit about the roots of the holiday and some of its most important symbols. And so we're going to spend our last 15 minutes together talking about the different symbolisms of the matzah and some of the different themes of Passover that it's meant to help us contemplate. And what you'll see is that I think, you know, we always think about, okay, well, we eat matzah because we were in a hurry as we were leaving Egypt, and you know, we didn't have time to bake our bread, and that's the story. But actually, there are multiple interpretations of the symbolism of the matzah, and we're going to take a look at 3 of them today. One of them is a biblical text, and then the other 2 are post-biblical. One's a Talmudic text, and one is actually a text from the Passover Haggadah. So we're going to start with text number 3. This is, we're going back again to the book of Exodus. And so although what we read before from the book of Exodus really just mentioned the Passover sacrifice, we do see that in fact this chapter of the Tanakh does have some mention of the matzah element of the holiday, although it's not necessarily tied in the same way with the holiday as it is later on in the book of Leviticus. So I'm going to once again share my screen with you. So we are looking on page 3 here, if you're looking at your own documents, we're looking at text number 3. We're back again to the book of Exodus, which we started with, chapter 12, and we're looking at verses 33 and 34, and then at verse 39. It says, "The Egyptians urged the people on, impatient to have them leave the country, for they said, 'We shall all be dead.' So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls wrapped in their cloaks upon their shoulders. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough that they had taken out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, since they had been driven out of Egypt and could not delay, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves." So take that screen away. So this is really the symbolism of the matzah that we're all very familiar with. The idea that the Israelites had to rush out of Egypt, and they didn't have time to let their bread rise, and so they left Egypt in a hurry with these unleavened cakes, and that's matzah, and that's what we eat over the holiday of Passover. So we'll move to the next one, unless anybody has any questions about this text, which I'm happy to answer as well. And otherwise, we'll look at some of the interpretations that you may not have had an opportunity to consider before. Any questions? And I'll give it a minute for raised hands on this particular text. Okay, so now I'm going to ask you to take a look at your rhythms source book from Melton. We're going to look at page 265, and this is another interpretation of what the matzah that we eat on Passover symbolizes. This one is I think it's a really neat one. It's a really interesting one. This one comes to us from the Babylonian Talmud. So it's the rabbinic text that comes after the Mishnah. So the rabbis are basically taking these early legal texts from the Mishnah and then arguing about them and trying to figure out how they apply to the actual observance of our lives. And rarely do the rabbis come to an agreement about anything, and rarely do we finish a section of the Talmud knowing what we're actually supposed to do. And so this comes from the Babylonian Talmud, from the section called Brachot, which means blessings. And so it goes, into depth about a lot of different blessing and prayer experiences. So we read on page 265, after concluding his prayers, Rabbi Alexandri would say, "Master of the worlds, it is surely known to you that we desire to do your will, but what is holding us back? The yeast in the dough, the evil inclination in man," which in Hebrew is called the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. That's a term that many of you may have heard before. "And the subjugation to the nations." I'll read that sentence again. So what is holding us back from doing God's will? The yeast in the dough and the subjugation to the nations. May it be your will to deliver us from their hands, so that we may again perform your statutes with a perfect heart. So this is a symbol of chametz, or an explanation of chametz that you may not have heard before, but actually is very prominent, particularly within Hasidic texts. You'll see it as well. The idea that the leavening in the dough is representative of, here it's the evil inclination in people. Sometimes you'll see of, it's a symbol of like whatever is like extra and unnecessary in our lives. Whereas matzah, which is, flat and unleavened, it doesn't have anything extra to it, is an opportunity for us to sort of like rid ourselves of, anything that isn't serving us in our lives, anything that we might consider to be, extraneous, anything that we might consider to be, reflective of our, least helpful inclinations here. So I see a hand up, and I have to apologize because all it says is iPhone, so I don't know whose it is, but I am.
It's
Wait,
me,
you
it's
are-
Alan Markowitz.
Oh, hello.
Hi. I always felt that the chumetz part has to do with forgetting the leaving in haste business, but the chumetz versus the matzah has to do with being humble.
Mhm.
So when you add water to the dough, you rise. So it makes you grander, makes you more desirable. It adds to your being. Where the Passover story, we had nothing, we did nothing. It was all God. So there's nothing to keep us outside of humbleness. We should maintain our humbleness because it was God that brought us out. You know, we talk about Hanukkah and things like that, where we went out, like the Maccabees did something before they became victorious. Here, the Israelites did nothing. And it was all God. So I think part of the symbolism of matzah is to remain humble.
Absolutely. Yes, I absolutely, I agree with you. And I think that's it's a really good point that you're bringing up. That, and we talked about one of the tensions in the Passover Seder being the fact that, so much of it is celebrating freedom and celebrating all of the luxuries that come along with freedom. So for instance, we're drinking 4 glasses of wine and we're using pillows and we're reclining. So the fact that we're doing all of that and we're only eating unleavened bread is a real reminder to us that this is not supposed to be an experience only of victory, but an experience that reminds us reminds us to be humble and reminds us, as you mentioned as well, Alan, that we should be, thanking God and not necessarily humans. One of the things, and you may talk about this next week, that's interesting about the Passover Haggadah is it doesn't mention Moses anywhere, right? And so, human beings aren't necessarily supposed to be exalting ourselves in this. We're supposed to be exalting God. And so in that way, matzah becomes a symbol of humility and becomes, and leavening becomes a symbol of what we talk else. Have anything to add on this point? So, Fran.
I have a question, and maybe this is irrelevant, maybe this is Torah time and it's irrelevant, but if you go back to text 2 and 3, where it talks about first the lamb and the slaughtering and the roasting of the lamb, and then you go to text 3 in the sheets, and it talks about the matzah and making it and running. Does that suggest that that we should have been eating the matzah on the last day and not during? Because it feels like a timing issue of when the matzah is actually baked and eaten. It's eaten on the way out, but the lamb seems to be eaten earlier. Am I not understanding this, or is it irrelevant, or is it Torah time?
So I think it's a really interesting question about the timing here. I'm seeing a note that says my internet connection is unstable, so I'm going to give it 1 second to go away. Okay, looks like it's better now. So I think that's a great question that you're asking about the timing. But I think one of the things that we want to kind of remind ourselves and what we want to go back to is that our contemporary observance and the way that the Passover observance has evolved is not necessarily fully reflective of every step or stage of what the Passover observance would have looked like in biblical times. And so we saw, for instance, that the lamb was sacrificed on the 14th day, and then the holiday of Passover, or the festival have all mushed together. So, yes, I think you're right that in terms of the actual timing of the actual events of the Exodus from Egypt, the eating of the unleavened bread would have come after. because it was what we took with us when we left the land of Egypt, and the Passover sacrifice came before that. But the way in which we observe it today, as we mentioned before, all of the pieces sort of mashed together in a way that we do it all at once.
I'm just wondering if it's connected in some way to what Alan said about the issue of humility as we're leaving. Was that really the point of this timing issue? Because they must have noted it as a timing issue then, and maybe it has some deeper significance having to do with what Alan points out because of the timing issue. Or, I mean, I don't know. I just was curious.
Yeah, I don't know either, but I think that's a great question. I think that's a great question, and if anybody else has any thoughts on it, I would welcome them to chime in as well. Any other questions or thoughts on this idea that that the unleavened bread is meant to really symbolize humility for us? Anything else? Anyone else? All right. Well, so that leaves us with 4 minutes to talk about our last text together, and that again is in your purposes book on page 266. This is a text that's later. This is a medieval text that became part of our Passover Haggadah. Very famous line that's written in Aramaic. Halach ma'anya diachalu avahatana be'arad demitzrayim. So this is, again, like, we all read it every year. We, don't stop to think about it too much. But this is the bread of affliction that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. So does anyone want to point out for us what seems to not add up here? This is the bread of affliction our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt.
Yeah,
So
we ate it on the way out.
right. Yeah.
No, she hears me. I think she didn't mute
Yeah,
me.
I heard you. I forgot to mute you again. Yes, exactly. So thank you. And now I'll remute you, but I can always unmute you. Right. So we see here, it says this is the bread of affliction that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. But we just read before that it actually was this was the bread that we ate as we were leaving the land of Egypt. Right. So, something doesn't totally add up with that. We can't necessarily answer, why it doesn't totally add up, but what we can think through is what lesson do we learn from that? And for those of you who are familiar with the rest of the text, which, very famously continues, all who are hungry, come and eat. And all who need to share in the Passover sacrifice, come and share in our meal with us. So if you had to guess why in this medieval text we sort of changed our story a little bit and what we're meant to learn from that, what would you guess? So I'm going to start with Joni over here. And give me 1 second to unmute you. All right. You are unmuted. You're not unmuted. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, sorry. Start one more time. Sorry, for some reason you didn't unmute.
So I would suggest that from an earlier text, when it was talking about matzah being just the basics, nothing extra, that now it's related in the sense that it's the bread of affliction because it has nothing extra in it.
Okay, so the fact that there's nothing, the fact that it sort of relates to the Talmudic text that we just read before, the idea that there's nothing extra in it, and therefore it becomes, the bread of affliction in some ways.
That and it's a reminder.
Yeah. Anyone else? All right, I don't see any other hands up at this point, so which is fine because we are out of time anyway. But what I'll add to it is that this is a text that helps us transform our thinking a little bit about the holiday of Passover. And sorry, I'm gonna spotlight myself again. Sorry, Joni. So this is a text, and this is a way of looking at the practice of eating matzah that helps us to keep in mind the experience of other people who may be suffering. We know that that is one of the most important themes of Passover, is the idea that we were slaves in Egypt, and we went through this experience, and that experience should cause us to empathize with, and to help the stranger, to help, those who, the immigrant, et cetera, and so this way of reframing the bread of affliction, it's not only the bread that we ate when we left Egypt, but it's the bread that we ate as slaves in Egypt. It again brings us this sense of humility, and also this reminder that our responsibilities extend beyond ourselves, to the wider world. And so with that, I don't know if Rabbi Reiser has joined the call yet. You're here, good. So I'll just say that it's really been a pleasure having an opportunity to study with all of you. I hope that I'll have other opportunities to interact with each of you while not in person, at least either by phone or over email in the coming days. So send me an email, let me know how you're doing. I'm thinking of all of you, and I'll look forward to another opportunity to learn again soon. And so with that, I will turn it over to Rabbi Reiser.
Thanks so much, Cantor. Yasher koach. This is normally when we take our snack break, but given that everybody is in the comfort of their own home, I hope that you've been snacking all along. And I have indeed noticed a couple people get up and get a glass of water or whatever else you may need. You should feel free throughout this conversation to do exactly that. If you need to take a little stretch break, feel free. But I think we should go ahead and continue with our learning rather than take a scheduled break for all of us. So we're going to move on to the other curriculum, which is the purposes curriculum. So again, that's the black reader, or that's white. That's the white readers. If you're not already finding that, you should go ahead and pull it up. We're going to be in lesson 25 in the white readers. The first page in those readers for this lesson is page 275. And you can also pull up the outline, which I circulated this morning for this lesson on Destruction and Exile. I'll give everyone a minute to kind of get all those materials together. So even if you're still pulling your materials together, I'll read for us at the top of the outline, which I sent around, what like the big idea for this session is. Here's what we're going to learn together over the next hour. It's the following: that throughout Jewish history, destruction and exile have been recurring events, but the Jewish responses to these events have varied widely. So you don't need a rabbi to do the following. I'll look for someone actually by raising their hand. I'm gonna go right now and lower hands to complete for me the following joke. You all know this joke. So someone who would raise their hand to complete the following joke. Every Jewish holiday can be summed up really simply in just 3 sentences. They tried to kill us, but
they didn't. Let's eat.
Bingo. Yeah, I've heard it. They tried to kill us, but we won. Let's eat. They tried to kill us, but they didn't. Let's eat. There's an unfortunate truth to that. I guess that's why comedy works, is because it points at something that's true. Jewish history does indeed have a lot of stories of either they tried to kill us, or they destroyed our temple, or they kicked us out of there, or worse. And we're going to look today at how different Jewish thinkers in the biblical period responded when something like that happened. We're going to look at how 2 contemporary Jewish thinkers responded when something like that happened. And then at the end, hopefully we'll be able to synthesize a little bit. So I know that we already said a blessing for study. We don't need to repeat that. So let's dive right into our first biblical text. This is listed as text number 3 in the reader, but for us, it's the first thing we're going to look at. It's a selection from Psalm 137. We've looked at this psalm a couple of different times throughout our year together so far, which gives you kind of a sense of how different Jewish texts are sort of more centerpieced, to invent a new verb, are more made a centerpiece of Jewish life than others are. So the fact that we've seen this one a couple of times tells us something about its importance to our people's practice and literature. For the sake of your not getting tired of my voice over the next 55 minutes, would someone who raises their hand volunteer to read for us the English of Psalm 137? Again, it's on the handouts that I sent around. Okay, Diane, I think I saw your hand go up. Let me unmute you. Okay, Diane, take it away.
By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept, as we thought of Zion. There on the poplars, we hung up our lyres, for our captors asked us there for songs, our tormentors for amusement. Sing us songs of Zion.
Pause for 1 second, Diane. If you've learned with me before, and I think all of us have at this point, then you know that I am sort of known for interrupting people after I've asked them to read something for me.
That's fine.
So I didn't interrupt you even quite quickly enough. I wanted to interrupt us at the very beginning when Diane read for us, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat. So that first of all tells us something about when this psalm takes place. This psalm is written during the time of the Babylonian exile. So remember, the Babylonian Empire came through and destroyed the kingdom of Judea in the year 586 BCE, so 586 years before the Common Era, exiled all of the elites, all of the leaders of the Jewish community away to Babylon. And now we're hearing some of those exiled leaders telling us about their experience there in Babylon. So Diane, now having sufficiently interrupted you, would you take it again from the top for us, Psalm 137?
By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept, as we thought of Zion. There on the poplars, we hung up our lyres, for our captors asked us there for songs, our tormentors for amusement. Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing a song of the Lord on alien soil? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue stick to my palate. If I cease to think of you, if I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour.
Okay, and pause there for 1 second again, Diane. I'm going to just note a couple of things and then I'll open it up for other people's comments before we move on to the second stanza of this poem. So just a couple of things to highlight. This great image of these exiled leaders taking their musical instruments, their lyres, and hanging them up on the trees. Picture that like in a Chagall painting. I think there may even be a Chagall painting where there's violins hanging from the trees. How sad. We have to hang our musical instruments up from the trees.
In the chapel that where the Roosevelts had the church with Chagall windows.
There are some Chagall windows up at that church in Pocantico Hills. I'm not sure if that specific image is there, but there are Chagall windows up there. A couple other things just to note from this first stanza, which Diane read for us, are the following. The captors are asking the Israelite captives to sing a song of their native land. Imagine the insult of that. Like, okay, what I'm about to say is really dark. It's really sad. But imagine like people who were being gathered on the train platform of their hometown to be sent off by the Nazis to unfortunate fates, being asked to like, hey, being asked by the Nazis themselves, hey, could you sing for us like, you know, Avinu Malkeinu? Can you imagine? That's the kind of degradation that these leaders are being put under. And how do they respond? They say, we can't. How can we sing a song of our homeland? How can we sing a song to our God while we're on alien soil? As if like they can't even like get the melody right on alien soil. How can we do this? Fifth verse, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. So important for them to remember their home is that if they ever were to forget their home while they're here in this exile, that they should become incapacitated in a certain way. Let my tongue stick to my palate if I cease to think of you, if I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour. And let me just make one more comment, and then I'm going to open it up for conversation, and then I'm going to ask Diane to continue reading for us. I mentioned this a little bit in last week's YouTube video about marriage, which is that in a very traditional wedding, Jewish wedding, just before the groom stomps on the glass, he's supposed to recite these verses. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, let my tongue stick to my palate. If I cease to think of you, if I do not keep Jerusalem in my memory, even at my happiest hour, just before he's supposed to stomp on the glass. Now, this is not a trick question, what I'm about to ask. It's actually a quite obvious one. But anyone care to connect the dots for us between why those two verses should be read right before the groom stomps on the glass? You can let us know by raising your hands. No takers. Okay. I'll connect the dots for us, which is that you've probably heard a rabbi say that this couple is supposed to, even on their happiest day. Oh, Fran, why don't you take it away for us?
I got it. I think I got it.
I think you got it. Go for it.
The breaking of the glass, one of the symbols is the destruction of the temple. And that is symbolic of Jews being exiled, and the groom should be remembering that as he's marrying a Jewish bride to continue the line of Jews. Even, I guess, even in the United States, it might even, it might also symbol the business of being in diaspora and not forgetting Jerusalem, despite where we live.
Very nice. Yeah.
How's that?
Terrific. Yeah, really nice. You even added layers that I hadn't thought of. The main thing I wanted us to get at there is that you've probably heard a rabbi say at a wedding when they break the glass, something like, this is to remind us that even on our happiest day, we should remember that we live in a world that's broken and that's in need of loving kindness, like the loving kindness that this couple shares with one another. And in the most traditional setting, that brokenness that the rabbi is talking about, the broken world we're living in the most traditional setting, that broken thing is the fact that the Jewish people don't have access to Jerusalem. Now, of course, today we do. So it's kind of a different thing. We'll leave that there. That's a whole nother course that we'll have to talk about some other time. Before I let Diane read for us the second stanza of this psalm, any other comments, reflections, questions so far on Psalm 137? Again, remembering that our theme is destruction and exile. All right, maybe before I call on hands we've seen recently, let me see if there's anyone else who wants to get in the conversation. I see your hand there, Fran. I know that this technology makes us all a little more shy to participate. I've been experiencing myself that all week. Okay, not seeing any other hands. Fran, let me unmute you again. Go for it.
I have a quick comment. As a speech pathologist, of course, this struck me immediately. And line 6, let my tongue stick to my palate. If I cannot speak of you, Jerusalem, let me not speak of anything. Let me lose my ability to express myself at all. It's a very powerful statement.
I love that. Really, really nice. I really love it when people bring their own professional expertise to bear on our text. Really nice one. Thanks for that, Fran. Let's move on and take a look at the second stanza. Diane, I'm going to unmute you. And if you would, please pick up for us at verse 7 of Psalm 137.
Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they cried, strip her to her very foundations. Fair Babylon, you predator, a blessing on him who repays you in kind, but you have inflicted on us, a blessing on him who seizes your babies and dashes them against the rocks.
Okay, so one of the more graphic images in the entire Hebrew Bible. And thank you, Diane, for reading for us. We won't linger on this for too long because, again, we've looked at this text before together. But this second stanza of the psalm would be like the introductory text to a course on Jewish revenge fantasy. There are lots of great examples in the Hebrew Bible of Jewish revenge fantasy. And even if you've never read the Hebrew Bible, but you've seen a Quentin Tarantino movie, then you know something about revenge fantasy. And the sort of like prevailing critical wisdom about this is that by playing out our revenge fantasy in literature or in film or on stage in burlesque, by doing it in those sort of like safe containers, it allows us to blow off steam and not actually commit those acts of violence that we might otherwise feel ourselves moved to commit. And these are pretty gruesome, violent acts that are being described here. A blessing on him who seizes your babies, meaning the babies of the Babylonians, the babies of the people who captured us. A blessing on him who seizes your babies and dashes them against the rocks. Wow, really gruesome, really graphic. And just one other thing to note about the second stanza is that verse 8 says, a blessing on him who repays you in kind what you have inflicted on us. And someone from this very group pointed out the last time that we studied this text, or asked the question, I guess, more accurately, of does that mean if what we're asking for is to repay unto the Babylonians what they did unto us, does then saying, let's smash their babies against the rocks necessarily mean that that's what the Babylonians did to our babies? And that's an interpretive question, so I can't say yes or no one way or the other. Like, I don't think there's any good historical evidence one way or the other, but it's a really nice interpretive question, and it paints a picture, at the very least, of the kind of pain that the Israelites felt, and at the very most, of the kind of actual violence that was inflicted upon the Israelites during the Babylonian exile. So this is a very open-ended and not a trick question, but I'm looking to draw you out. How would you characterize this kind of response to destruction and exile? Like right now, we've only seen one response so far, the response depicted in Psalm 37. Believe me, we're going to see some other kinds. But help us to sort of characterize like what this response is like to destruction and exile. And you can, again, let us know you want to participate by raising a hand. Okay, Joni, I'm going to unmute you here. Why is this not working? Give me one sec, Joni. Okay, you should be on.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I'm echoing. Hold on.
Are you and Andy next to each other?
Yes.
Maybe if he.
Okay,
Yeah.
sounds good.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that the feeling is kind of like an eye for an eye, but I think that's very un-Jewish because we don't do that do unto others. We do that more of the don't do unto others. So I just think it doesn't mesh with what I've learned about, how we handle when we are wronged.
Very nice.
Like
Yeah.
a response is like, don't do unto others as you wouldn't want them to do to you, as opposed to do unto others.
Yes. Very nice. Very nice. And you said this thing about an eye for an eye also.
Yeah.
That also actually comes right from the Torah.
But first it comes from Hammurabi, right?
Does it? Someone who knows more about ancient Near Eastern literature could tell us. Well, if it first is in Hammurabi, then we inherited it from there. But it's right there in either Exodus or not Exodus, either in Leviticus or Numbers. This concept about that, that violence should be repaid eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, life for life. And as you kind of said, like it doesn't feel very Jewish. You're not the first person to feel that way. The rabbis, like the ancient rabbis, who saw that text, an eye for an eye, went out of their way to try and explain, well, not actually an eye for an eye. Maybe eye for an eye actually means monetary compensation. And they have to do a lot of like intellectual acrobatics in order to make the case that an eye for an eye means anything other than an eye for an eye. So I think you've done a good job of characterizing it. And let me call on some other hands rather than monopolizing the time. Ira, let me unmute you here. Go for it.
Yeah, I changed my background to make it more to the Babylonian for this one. But there's I think a very I think it's very apt that is from the Code of Hammurabi, eye for an eye, definitely. And but I think the whole concept shows the change in how Jewishness changed. I think we learned that a lot in this class, in other sections, that, the ancient Israelites, Hebrews were a much more violent people, up until really, I think, the time that of the, Roman wars where we were exiled into the diaspora that we're presently still in. And so, I think you see a lot of this, what we in modern times think of as not Jewish behavior, when you're looking back at some of these older stories, older versions of things. And, the rabbis, I think, after exile became much more worried that the Jews would be subject to violent attack if they demonstrated that they might be fomenting violence themselves or insurrection or anything like that. And so interpretations of some of these old texts, I think, changed over time. And I was just thinking about how, the last section that we did on Passover, it kind of it's in the same, the same thesis, which is, we take the Seder today and we try to modernize it and look at some of the language, including the last thing we talked about, which was, this is the bread of affliction that we ate, and we try to create, some modern story for why we, how it fits in our world. But that line was written by a medieval rabbi, and who knows, maybe they weren't really focused on the same things we're focused on now. It may just be an interpretation, from 7 languages ago, of how they're saying. It may not be that complicated, is what I'm saying. I don't think there's anything wrong with any of that. I think that's what I love about the way we practice Judaism, which is, we try to make it fit within the world that we all live in today and find meaning in it. And it feels to me like, that's something that we ought to be continuing to do.
Really nice, really nice. And I'll just tie together 2 different parts of your comment to say that even the Passover Haggadah has its own parts that are more tribalistic and even violent, but we probably don't ourselves read them at the Seder table. But there's a phrase in the Passover Haggadah that says "V'hisha amda something something something," which basically translates to, in every generation, someone has risen up against us to do bad unto us. And then it goes on to say, "Pour out your wrath, O God, among the nations of the world." And it has some pretty graphic descriptions of how, they should be punished for doing wrong to the Jewish people. So in the very same book where we are dipping out blood or dipping out wine for the lives lost of the Egyptians, there's still this other tendency of acting out violently. And I think you're right that it reflects not only like historical strata, but also just different tendencies in our own psyches and in the Jewish community at large. We could probably identify different groups like that today too. Thanks, Ira. Let me call on a couple of other hands. So Sarah, is this Sarah Stern?
It's actually Mark. So I'm
okay, Mark, great, even better.
So just to follow on what you said, the idea that we live in a modern world and therefore we don't do eye for eye, we do that or less. I think we don't live in that world. We live in that world in this country, and we live in that world in sort of a lot of countries, but there are a lot of countries in this world right now who don't live in that world. And that is, I guess, the point you were just making. I wanted to go back to eye for an eye and say that I think it was actually perhaps a moderation, that what they were doing by saying an eye for eye was actually limiting what maybe was happening, where it was if you took my eye, I'd kill you. Or if you did this, I'd kill you. And that it's quite possible that limiting it to like for like was actually a moderation and imposition of society, mores that didn't exist at that time. But
really nice. Really nice. I had never considered that. And in that case, it's a really good restricting of violence getting out of control, like only repay measure for measure as opposed to more than that. Really nice. Right. I'm going to take one last hand and then I'm going to move us on. It's going to be from Russell. Russell, let me unmute you. All right, go for it.
Oh, thank you very much. First, I agree with that interpretation of eye for an eye. That is how I read the passage as well. It actually is a moderating action, but that was not the reason why I had my hand up. I'd like to talk for a minute about this psalm as a poem, as a work of literature, and because I find some of the poetic techniques here not only very sophisticated but in many ways very terrifying and even manipulative, because as you follow the different verses, it begins with almost a cry for sympathy. we're sitting there, we're weeping. We've hung up our lyres. We can't enjoy life. Identify with us.
Mm-hmm.
And then it describes the humiliation that we experienced. And again, it's saying, please sympathize with us. And then it gradually transforms into what is essentially a call for jihad. And to me, the most shocking literary technique at all is the phrase fair Babylon, which is irony, I think, bordering on sarcasm. And I don't think of there being a lot of all the literary techniques we have in the Torah, I don't think of sarcasm as one of them. But it's at best ironic saying, Babylon, you're such a beautiful city, and yet you could do this. But I think it's saying, fair Babylon, you predator. It's sarcasm, and it says, a blessing upon him who seizes your babies and dashes them against the rocks. And I find it extraordinary, just as literary techniques, how it can draw you in with a kind of, with a genuine empathy, make you feel their humiliation, and suddenly, through these literary turns, turn this into a war cry.
Really nice, really, really nice comment. Thank you for that. And I agree with you that fair Babylon phrase really does, I don't know, twist the knife, even that's not quite the right phrase, twist the knife, but it's an interesting phrase there. And I agree with you that it does something powerful the way that it's used there. Let's take a look at our second text, which is going to present a different kind of response to destruction and exile. So we've kind of seen so far how Psalm 137 presents a Jewish response to destruction and exile. Let's look now at this selection from the book of Jeremiah. It's in our handouts, which again I sent around early this morning, so you can find it there. Is there someone who'd be willing to read for us the English translation of these couple of verses from the book of Jeremiah? You can let me know by raising your hand. Okay, Nancy, let me unmute you. Go for it, Nancy.
Where it says, this is the text?
Yes, exactly.
This is the text of the letter which the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the priests, the prophets, the rest of the elders of the exile community, and to all the people whom, I'm not even going to try.
Nebuchadnezzar.
Thank you. Had exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon.
So pause right there. Again, this is me following my own tradition of constantly interrupting. To just, again, say this text takes place in the exact same time as the one that we just looked at. The last one we read, Psalm 137, by the rivers of Babylon. That one's taking place in Babylon. It's being written by those elites who got exiled to Babylon. This one is getting written back in Jerusalem by a Jewish leader, Jeremiah, a prophet, writing to the people who are in Babylon. So it's the exact same time, it's the exact same event that they're responding to in the wake of the Babylonian destruction and exile. The only difference is that one is written by those who were exiled and one is being written by someone who stayed behind. Consider that difference as we read the difference here of perspective. So Nancy, would you continue for us?
Sure.
Actually, take it from the top one more time now that I've sufficiently interrupted.
This is the text of the letter which the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the priests, the prophets, the rest of the elders of the exile community, and to all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon. Quote, "Thus said the eternal hosts, the God of Israel, to the whole community which I exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their fruit, take wives and beget sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons, and give your daughters to husbands, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there, do not decrease, and seek the welfare of the city to which I have exiled you, and pray to the Eternal on its behalf, for in its prosperity you shall prosper."
Okay, thank you, Nancy. So let me just unpack this a little bit myself first before we open it up for more conversation. So again, Jeremiah, still in Jerusalem, writing to those who've been exiled away in Babylon. And here's what he says to them. He says the following: build houses and live in them out there in Babylon. But hold on, before he even says that, he says, this is the word of God. God spoke to me, Jeremiah, the prophet. My job, by the way, is to be a spokesperson for God. That's what a prophet is a spokesperson for God. God spoke to me, and what God wanted me to tell you that God wants you to do is the following. You out there in Babylon should build houses and live in them. You should plant gardens and eat their fruit. Very different from what we heard those who were in Babylon were actually doing. They were hanging up their lyres on the trees. They were lamenting the terrible things that had happened to them. He's saying, build houses, plant gardens, take wives and sons and daughters, multiply there, do not decrease. Seek the welfare of the city to which I have exiled you. Like, instead of saying, fair Babylon, you predator, a blessing on him who repays you in kind what you have inflicted on us, what the psalm said, do the exact opposite. Pray for the welfare of the city to which I have exiled you. Like, may Babylon grow and prosper, because in its prosperity, you shall prosper. So I see Andy's got a hand up before I even ask a question. So Andy, let me hear what you want to say. I'm trying to unmute you.
Oh,
Okay,
yeah.
go for it, Andy.
Oh, well, I was going to say, go ask your question, but or you want to ask your question first?
No, actually, I'm happy to hear comments before the question.
Yeah, so interesting advice, because since we're on the topic of Pesach, this is kind of what got us in trouble in Egypt, right? We were fruitful, we multiplied, we became a nation within a nation, and then the Pharaoh said, well, wait a second, these guys are getting too powerful. And this is the advice that Jeremiah is giving to the people in Babylon with the knowledge of what happened in Egypt. So it's just kind of an interesting conclusion that he comes to given our past experience.
Interesting. So the point being then that if we do settle ourselves down in these countries where we are being oppressed or likely to be oppressed, that it can lead to negative consequences as it did in Egypt?
And if we multiply and build houses and beget sons and daughters in a nation, then the rulers, may see us and enslave us.
Interesting. See us as a threat. Let's call on some other hands. Russell, you're unmuted.
Yes, to me, these two demonstrate the classic dilemma of assimilation that the Jewish people have always faced, just as Hanukkah seems to celebrate radical non-assimilation, and Purim celebrates the triumph of assimilation. Both of these examples are telling us the two different ways we have to live, and that we somehow have to balance the two of them.
Very nice. Yes, exactly. Very well put. These are kind of two poles of Jewish life, which will continue to play out over history and even to today. I wonder if anyone has a thought on sort of why, or rather, what do you make of the fact that Jeremiah, who stayed behind in Jerusalem, has one perspective, and those who get exiled have a different perspective? Like, how do you account for their difference in location, their difference in circumstance, and how it impacts on their difference in perspective? No takers? Oh, I see one. Okay, here we go.
It's Alan.
Alan, take it away.
Marcus. I think there's a parallel there between Babylon and the exile, between the diaspora and people who are living in Eretz Israel.
Say more.
Well, there's many different things. It's funny. If you're living outside of Israel, you expect people who live in Israel to be observant. And frankly, they're all Orthodox, but they don't go to shul. So it's that, and then you expect the people who are living in Israel today to be the maintainers of the flame, and then we look to them to maintain the traditions and the attitudes and the lifestyle that we can't, because we can't be in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who live in Israel, they say, nah, we take this all for granted. We're living for today. It's just a different take on their obligations for observance.
I don't think he does.
And then can you make the connection for us between that observation about today and the difference between Jeremiah and the psalmist?
I'm not sure I can without looking at the data.
Okay, fair enough. Nice comment. I do see that it looks like Norman has unmuted himself. Norman, is there a comment you're wanting to make?
Yeah, yes, I did that. We've been cut off from you. I'm glad. What I wanted to comment on is that Babylon is the first diaspora. And what Jeremiah is saying is that it's okay for Jews to live outside of the land of Israel. That's never been said before. And it really is sort of a anticipation of the next 2,000, 3,000, 2,500 years of Jewish history.
Yeah, really nice. I fully agree. It's interesting to me that it's Jeremiah who's saying that, he who is safe there in the land of Israel. It hasn't been kicked out of it. Before I, though, give my sort of comment on it, I see that Mark's also got his hand up. So, Mark, take it away.
I'm so proud of you. Look how you're.
Yeah, two quick things. One is, what is Jeremiah doing in Jerusalem? I thought they sent all the fancy people up. Yeah, he didn't get sent for some reason. I take some exception. I'm not sure that they didn't do what this letter said in Babylon. The beginning of the previous reading said, there on the poplars we hung up our lyres, meaning that if they had them out, they were probably playing them and singing and having a nice time until the captors came and asked them for their songs. So it may be that they were doing all the things that this letter said. I don't see any evidence that they weren't.
Nice comment. Yeah, fair point for sure. The one piece that I think is a little harder to argue against is the difference between pray for the welfare of the city compared to in the Psalm, they're actively praying again for the destruction of that city. So let me make one last comment about this Jeremiah letter, maybe before we see if anyone else has thoughts or comments they'd like to make, which is, this is a relatively obvious comment, is that it's easy for Jeremiah, who hasn't been sent to Babylon, which, as Mark says, is kind of strange. But it's easy for Jeremiah, who hasn't been sent to Babylon, to say, yeah, it's not so bad. Just build houses, take wives, pray for the welfare of the city. He is not he's not feeling the pain in the same way that those who've been exiled are. So it just points out for me the fact that different experiences, our own different experiences, lead us to our different responses to destruction and exile. So again, if our big idea today is that there are varying Jewish responses to destruction and exile, we might ask ourselves, well, why? And a reason why is because destruction and exile impacts each of us differently. Let me make a contemporary example. American Jewry, my grandparents, who lived through the time of the Holocaust, but lived through the time of the Holocaust from their houses in Brooklyn, had a very different kind of response to that horrible period in Jewish life than European Jewry did. And so that, again, this is sort of a very obvious observation, but it helps us to understand why there are differing Jewish responses to bad things that happen to us, because we all have different contexts in which we understand those bad things happening to us. We all have different experiences that have led us to where we are. I see that Marcia, you've unmuted yourself. Marcia, is there a comment that you're wanting to make?
Yes, actually, the comment I was going to make is what you just said, that it's easy for Jeremiah sitting in Jerusalem to tell them to assimilate and prosper. He doesn't really know what they're going through.
Right.
So,
yeah.
I guess I've tried to speak before, but I didn't realize I had to unmute myself. So, hi.
Hello, glad to see you. Yes,
Thank
and
you.
so for anyone else who's having that same problem, if you haven't been able to figure out the raise hand function on Zoom here, you can also use the chat to let me know you want to say something, or actually I'm discovering that if you unmute yourself, I see that you're unmuted, and that kind of lets me know that you're in the queue and that you have something you want to share. Let me just add one last little, I want to just remind us again of what, I can't remember who it was now who said it, that Russell said to us about these two texts kind of set up the poles of diaspora versus Land of Israel. I'm going to move us on to our next thing, which is on page 3 of the handouts, which I circulated this morning. The next thing I want us to look at are actually 2 selections that are not part of the Melton course reader. These are texts that are just familiar to me and that I wanted to share with you because I think they take this ancient example that we've just given of 2 different responses to the exact same situation and give us a contemporary, very clear illustration of it. You know, I think one thing that's missing in the Melton curriculum is not enough interesting contemporary voices. And so I wanted to share these 2 contemporary voices with the rest of us. So let me just give a little bit of introduction to both of these and then I'll have different people read them for us. So again, these are in your handouts on page 3. The 2 texts that have kind of like a title that are underlined. The first text is by a writer and thinker called Simon Ravidovich. He's got one of the more fun names to say in the canon of Jewish thinkers, Ravidovich. You'll see in his little bio line that he was born in Poland at the end of the 1800s and eventually emigrated to the United States and became the chair of the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Brandeis, lived through the time of the Holocaust, but did so in the United States. The second text is by a fellow named Salo Baron. He also was born in Poland at the end of the 1800s, emigrated to the United States and became an academic, although he went and taught at Columbia in the Department of History. And so these are just like our last 2 texts, 2 people who lived through horrible times for the Jewish people. They both came to America before the Holocaust, and none of them, you know, were in, you know, the worst of it in Europe. But nevertheless, 2 different responses to the events of the 20th century for the Jewish people. Ravidovich has a famous essay called Israel, the Ever-Dying People, and here's a short excerpt from that. Is there someone who would, and again, it's important to note, I've noted this on our outline, that he first presented this before he published it. It was actually published posthumously after he died, like in the 80s. But he first presented these ideas as a lecture in 1948, so squarely after the Holocaust, but before or right concurrent with the founding of the State of Israel. I see, Bob, you've got a hand up. Is that a volunteering to read for us?
No, but Jane is.
Okay, Jane, would you read for
We're
us?
a team here.
Great.
Going deeper into the problem, and here I have to confine myself to a hint, I'm often tempted to think that this fear of cessation was fundamentally a kind of protective individual and collective emotion.
Okay, pause. I'm going to pause you right there because I've brought us in the middle of the first chapter of his book. He's been for the past many pages spelling out how seemingly in every generation from the time of Abraham until today, or his day rather, I should say, the Jewish people have been obsessively worried that we're about to be done, that this will be the last generation of Jewish people. Remember that Abraham complains to God and says, hey, God, how could you have made this promise to me that my offspring are going to inherit the land of Israel? And meanwhile, I don't have any offspring. Even Abraham himself thought that he was going to be the last generation of Jews. And just one little sidebar tidbit, a mentor of mine wrote his master's thesis on material from like the American Jewish archives. And he studied like all of this writing that the American Jewish community did like in the early 20th century. And they were asking the exact same questions in like 1919 as we're asking today. Like, how are we going to get young people interested in Judaism? How are we going to make sure that this isn't the last generation of committed people who belong to synagogues and who support federations? So anyway, the point of all of this is that Ravidovich has been saying in every generation, from Abraham until today, we've been worried that we're going to be the last generation of Jews. It seems to be an obsession that we're worried that we're dying out. Jane, if you would continue for us.
Jewry had indulged so much in the fear of its end that its constant vision of the end helped it to overcome every crisis, to emerge from every threatening end as a living unit, though much wounded and reduced. And anticipating the end became its master. Thus, no catastrophe could ever take this end-fearing people by surprise, so as to put it off its balance, still less to obliterate it, as if its incessant preparation for the end made this very end absolutely impossible.
Okay, so in a word, Ravidovich is saying, if we are Israel, the ever-dying people, again, that's the title of the essay, the fact of our constant fear that we are going to be obliterated, the fact that we're always afraid of our obliteration is exactly what keeps us going forward for forever. He says that the kind of reaction to destruction that we see in Psalm 137 is actually really productive and helps keep us thriving and going. Okay, let's leave it there. Anyone have any comments or questions about this Ravidovich text? I don't want to spend too much time on it, honestly. Okay, if not, let's take a look at the sort of text in conversation with this one from Selah Baron. Someone who would read for us the Lachrymose Conception of Jewish History. Okay, Marcia, I see you raising your hand. Let me unmute you here.
See me now, okay.
Yeah, okay, go for it.
Unmuted.
And actually, Marcia, before you start, we
Yes.
can all anticipate that if Ravidovich is kind of somehow in sync with Psalm 137, that Selah Baron is going to be somehow in sync with Jeremiah. So take it away for us, Marcia.
The Lachrymose Conception of Jewish History. It would be a mistake to believe that hatred was the constant keynote of Judeo-Christian relations, even in Germany or Italy. It is in the nature of historical records to transmit to posterity the memory of extraordinary events, rather than the ordinary flow of life. A community that lived in peace for decades may have given the medieval chronicler no motive to mention it, until a sudden outbreak of popular violence lasting a few days attracted widespread attention. Since modern historical treatment can no longer be satisfied with the enumeration of wars and diplomatic conflicts, the history of the Jewish people among the Gentiles, even in medieval Europe, must consist of more than stories of sanguinary clashes or government expulsions. That's really interesting because it's like you don't read about happy things in the newspaper. You only read about catastrophes and murders and fires and wars and conflict. And Tolstoy's famous saying, all happy families alike, and all unhappy families have their own problems. I'm paraphrasing, obviously.
Nice. Yes, really, really nice. I love that. Is that Anna Karenina?
I think so, yes. I think that's the beginning of Anna Karenina.
Right. Yes, I think what you said about the news is here being expressed about history. That we have a tendency to talk about, we've talked a lot about, I've mentioned the Holocaust a lot today, and for a reason. We're on a theme that's very local. We have a tendency to teach a lot about the Holocaust. We have a tendency to speak a lot about the Jewish expulsion from Spain. We talk about the Babylonian exile. We talk about the Roman destruction. But do we as often talk about the golden age of Jewish Spain? Do we talk about the golden age of Jews in Germany? There's a really, I hate to say, not very good, but important book called The Pity of It All. Anyone heard of the book The Pity of It All? You could let us know by raising your hand or saying something in the chat. The book The Pity of It All is about the history of German Jewry from like 1100 up until 1933. Like it's the story of German Jewry that you don't hear. All that probably most of us or most Jews know about Jews and Germany is that it was a horrible place for Jews starting in 1933. And the truth is that it was actually a really wonderful place for Jews for like 500 years before that, if not even probably a little bit longer. And that's what Selah Baron is making the case for here, which is that we have this lachrymose conception of Jewish history. We think of it as all exile and destruction, but the truth is there actually were really important golden eras too. Let's pause and do a little bit of sort of now synthesizing or zooming out. I have suggested that these two texts, the Ravidovich and the Baron, are somehow in a similar kind of conversation with one another as are two ancient texts, Psalm 137 and Jeremiah's letter. How do you feel about that? Is that a fair comparison? Have I missed something glaring? What do you think? Before I see your hand, Marcia, before I call on it, let me see if there are any others who we haven't heard from recently. Or maybe I should ask a first question, which is before you disagree with it, which you'd be welcome to. I actually really like that. Is anyone able to sort of connect the dots as to like why I think that these two are in a similar kind of conversation with each other as the first two were? Okay, no takers. I'll say this then, which is that where Psalm 137 says, never settle down in a foreign country, always remember your destruction. Jeremiah is saying, no, you have to go on with your life in that other country, make the best of it. Similar kind of dynamic here between these two. Rabbi Dovich is saying, we get a lot out of remembering the bad times in Jewish life. Remembering the threats against us actually propels us forward. Baron is saying kind of the opposite, which is we focus too much on the bad things that have happened to us. We need to be, and I see your hand there, Mark. We need to remember our golden eras too. Mark, what would you like to add?
He'd like to add that his wife has something to say.
Yay, good. Hi, Sarah.
Hey there. I don't see that these two, the 20th century ones, are necessarily in conflict with each other. That, yeah, we remember the bad things, but you have to live your life. And I kind of think that's what Jeremiah was saying. Both pieces were saying, make the best of a bad time, but don't forget your roots. And remember that bad times may be coming, so be prepared. Semper paratus, to quote another organization.
Very nice. So you see these two as not being so much in conflict, the two contemporary ones not being in conflict with one another. And
the two ancient ones, I think they're in conversation with each other.
Very nice. I appreciate that. I really like that. Thank you. Anyone else want to get in on this piece of the conversation before we move to sort of like a summative thing? Nancy, hi.
Hi. I don't know exactly how to say this, but all this stuff about the history kind of leaves the history focus leaves out the arts and the literature.
Say more, keep going.
And that, I think that the arts and literature give a rounder and maybe fills out the picture, doesn't make everything so bleak and, I don't know, violent or negative or defeatist, I don't know.
Gotcha. So like if all we ever study is Jewish history, then we might be inclined to only look, as history is wont to do, at the history of war and the history of conflict and the history of expulsion. Whereas if we study other fields of Jewish studies, not just Jewish history, but also Jewish literature, Jewish artistry, Jewish, I don't know what else, then
glory.
Say again?
Then you would see the glory, hopefully.
Very nice. Yeah. Okay, Fran, I see your hand too.
I think that, as Sarah said, I think they're looking at two sides of the same coin in a lot of ways. We can't ignore the adversity and the struggle and the not being the dominant culture in a lot of the places that we've lived. And we have to be wary of how people are going to treat us when economics are bad or some crazy person comes into power. It's just part of our DNA. We got to know that. We can't walk around with rose-colored glasses and make believe it never happened and it's never going to happen again, because that's dumb. Mm-hmm. But as Jeremiah says, live your life, enjoy, but you are in a strange land and know that. I mean, I don't think he's arguing that you should make believe that things are cool. Mm-hmm. Saying, you're still Jewish and you still have children and you still have a life and there are things you can enjoy, but you are in the diaspora and you are not the dominant culture, and you have to figure out how to get along with those people so that you can have a good life. And I think that's true of all of us always, except in Israel. You know, that's cool. I mean, you go to Israel, it's like, wow, the bus driver is Jewish. What is this?
Right.
You know? That's really an amazing thing. I remember that's what my kids said when they came home from their time in Israel, that's what was so remarkable. Everybody was, well, not everybody obviously, but Jews were the dominant culture. And that does make a difference in our lives, always.
Very nice. So I want to help just kind of move us towards concluding, because we are approaching our time barrier here. You'll see on the handouts that there are 3 other texts that I thought we maybe would spend time on. We're not going to spend time on all 3 of them for sure. But let me just say one word about what they are. Text 5, which would have been a selection from the Babylonian Talmud, from Tractate Bava Batra, 60b, basically tries to strike a balance between these 2 things. You could read it on your own some other time, but it essentially says, like, look, after a destruction, you need to both remember the terrible thing that happened and go on living your life. So, for example, if you need to be painting your house, then paint your house, because that's what you need to do to go on living your life. But if painting your house is like a symbol of joy, you know, if adding color to your life feels uncomfortable in a time when we're supposed to be remembering the most recent tragedy that befell the Jewish people, then what can you do? You can leave one patch of wall unpainted. And it goes on with like a couple other examples like that of how the Jewish people are to kind of strike a balance between remembering tragedy, but also going on living our lives nevertheless. That's what text 5 gets at. And you could look at it yourself sometime if you'd like to. We're going to end with my summarizing texts 10 and 11, which again, also you can look at your leisure, maybe after we conclude this call. Texts 10 and 11 present a really important Jewish theological idea, which is the following. Each text in its own way kind of says it a little bit differently, but here's the idea. The texts say that whenever the Jewish people has gone into exile, that they didn't go into exile alone. That when the Jewish people were kicked out of the land of Israel and sent to Babylon, that actually God went along with them to Babylon. When the Romans came and sacked Jerusalem in 70 CE, that God too was displaced and God went into exile with the Jewish people too. It's a really important theological concept that when these terrible things befall our people, they don't befall us alone, they befall us and our God. As if to say that we're a people who believes that we're never alone in our suffering. We tend to think that like the idea that like God is with you in your suffering is like a Christian idea. And we've unfortunately let our Christian brothers and sisters have that idea and sort of take it from us in certain ways, but make no mistakes about it. That's a very Jewish concept, that when bad things happen, especially when bad things happen, God is with us. God cares about us. God goes into exile with us. Notice that it doesn't say God makes it better. It just says that God is there with us when we're in our moment of exile. This theological insight, I think, has helped to sustain the Jewish people for so many thousands of years and for so many terrible tragedies that have befallen us, helped to give us some feeling, if not of hope, and I do think of hope, then at the very least of comfort. So maybe I'll leave us with like a hope or a wish for each of us, which is that, you know, we can each, God forbid it should be anytime soon, but when we have bad things that will indeed happen to us, and it should be much less severe than the destruction of the Second Temple or the, you know, kicking out of Jews from Jerusalem by the Romans. But when these bad things happen to us, may we know what our people have believed for a very long time, which is that when we experience destruction, exile, suffering, that wherever we go, God goes there with us. With that, we'll conclude our time together. thanks everybody. Hope that you're doing okay during this crisis, and please reach out with anything that you may need. Take care.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. I don't know how to turn, I don't know how you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Unmuted you, so I'll say bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Same time next Tuesday?
Same time, yep, next Tuesday, same time.
Well, let's just, how about that?